The air in Ravenshade Plantation hung thick and wet, like breathing through cloth soaked in molasses. August had settled over St. James Parish with a vengeance, turning the sugar-cane fields into a shimmering green hell that stretched from the muddy banks of the Mississippi River all the way to the cypress swamps beyond. The heat didn't just touch you here, it wrapped around your bones and squeezed until your very soul felt like it might melt and drip onto the red Louisiana clay. Clara moved through the rows of cane like a rumor, barely noticed, hardly remembered. Her bare feet made no sound on the earth, and her thin cotton dress, faded to the color of dirty water, clung to her slight frame. She was perhaps 25 years old, though the plantation records listed no birth date for her. Only a purchase receipt from a Charleston auction house dated 1838, noting one female, approximately 16 years, mute, suitable for housework. Indeed, the other enslaved people on Ravenshade gave her a wide berth, not out of cruelty, but out of something deeper, a primal unease that settled in the stomach when Clara's dark eyes fixed on you for too long. Those eyes seemed too large for her thin face, always watching, always knowing something the rest of them didn't. Samuel, an older man who'd been at Ravenshade since before Clara arrived, remembered the day her tongue was cut. It was spring of 1839, and Clara had been working in the main house, helping with the birth of Mistress Adelaide Thornwood's first child. The baby came early, too early, and emerged silent and blue. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. The midwife, a free woman of color from New Orleans, had shaken her head and wrapped the tiny body in linen. But Clara, who'd never spoken a word in anyone's memory, had suddenly grabbed Mistress Thornwood's arm and opened her mouth. The sound that came out was like rusted hinges screaming, words tumbling over each other in a voice unused to forming them. Not the baby's fault. Not the baby. You took the medicine. You took it to stay thin. The baby knew. The baby saw what you are. Master Edmund Thornwood had been in the room. His face had gone white as plantation sugar, then red as the clay. He'd grabbed Clara by her hair and dragged her to the barn himself. The screaming that followed could be heard all the way to the quarters. When she emerged an hour later, blood pouring from her mouth, her tongue was gone, and with it, her voice. Or so they thought. Now, 4 years later, Clara worked in the laundry house, a sagging wooden structure behind the main plantation house where the slaves washed and pressed the Thornwoods' fine clothes. She spent her days up to her elbows in scalding water, her fingers raw and cracked from the lye soap, but she never complained. How could she? She had no voice to complain with. The other laundry women, Ruth, Mary, and old Bessie, tried to include her in their whispered conversations, but Clara never responded. She would simply nod or shake her head, her eyes always drifting to the window that faced the main house, as if she could see through the walls to whatever darkness lurked inside. It was Ruth who first noticed Clara's nighttime wanderings. Ruth slept in the cabin closest to the laundry house, and she'd wake sometimes to the sound of footsteps on the path outside. Through the gaps in the cabin walls, she'd see Clara's thin silhouette moving toward the main house, a piece of charcoal or a nail clutched in her hand. "That girl ain't right," Ruth whispered to Mary one morning as they scrubbed sheets in the big wooden tubs. "I seen her 3 times this week walking around after midnight like she got somewhere to be, and she always comes back with black under her fingernails, like she'd been digging or writing." Mary glanced over at Clara, who stood at the far end of the laundry house, hanging wet clothes on the line with mechanical precision. "Maybe she can't sleep. Lord knows none of us sleep easy in this place." "It ain't natural sleep she's missing," Ruth insisted, lowering her voice even further. "Last night, I swear I saw her standing outside Mr. Garrett's cottage, just standing there in her nightdress, staring at his door. And her lips was moving, like she was praying or cursing or something in between." James Garrett was the overseer at Ravenshade, a thick-necked man from Kentucky, with hands like ham hocks and a disposition like a cornered badger. He'd been hired by Master Thornwood 2 years prior, after the previous overseer had been found dead in the cane fields, his body covered in fire ant bites, though how so many ants had gotten inside his clothes remained a mystery no one cared to solve. Garrett ruled the plantation with a leather whip and an iron fist. He was the kind of man who enjoyed his work a little too much, who smiled when the whip cracked, who made examples out of the weak to keep the strong in line. The enslaved people of Ravenshade hated him with a quiet, simmering hatred that had no outlet, no release, no hope of satisfaction. So when Samuel came running to the quarters 3 days after Ruth saw Clara at Garrett's door, shouting that the overseer was dead, there was a moment of stunned silence before the questions began. "How?" someone asked. "His horse," Samuel said, his eyes wide with something between shock and satisfaction. That big black stallion he was so proud of. "They found Garrett this morning in the Northfield, trampled to death. His skull was caved in, ribs broken, face barely recognizable. The horse was standing over him, calm as Sunday morning, like nothing had happened." The slaves gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. Garrett's death was good news. No one would mourn him. But the circumstances were strange. That horse had always been gentle, well-trained. Garrett had boasted it was the finest animal in St. James Parish. It was Bessie who first mentioned the marks. "I seen something on his door," she said quietly, 3 days back, when I was taking the master's shirts to be mended. There was 3 little crosses carved into the wood of Mr. Garrett's door. Fresh carved, looked like, wood shavings still on the ground. The group fell silent. Eyes began to turn, slowly, toward the laundry house, where Clara could be seen through the open door, folding linens with her usual mechanical precision. "Clara been to his door," Ruth said slowly. "I seen her there 3 nights ago." "You saying Clara killed Mr. Garrett?" Mary asked, incredulous. "That slip of a girl. How would she even—" "Not killed him," Samuel interrupted. "Marked him. There's a difference." The conversation died as Master Thornwood's voice rang out across the yard, calling everyone to assembly. They gathered in front of the main house, where Thornwood stood on the wide porch, his face grave. Beside him stood his wife Adelaide, pale and nervous, her hands twisting a handkerchief. "James Garrett is dead," Thornwood announced, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "It was an accident with his horse. These things happen. We will hire a new overseer within the week. Until then, you will continue your work as usual. Anyone caught slacking will be punished severely, that is all." But as the crowd dispersed, a new unease had settled over Ravenshade Plantation. 3 crosses on a door, 3 days later, death, and a mute girl with eyes that saw too much. That night, as Clara lay on her thin mattress in the corner of the laundry house, she stared at the ceiling and remembered. She remembered the feeling that had come over her 3 nights ago. The cold certainty that had pulled her from her bed and drawn her to Garrett's cottage. She remembered her fingers finding the nail, remembered carving the 3 crosses into the wood while her lips moved in silent prayer or curse. She couldn't tell which. She hadn't killed Garrett. She'd simply announced what was already decided by powers older than the plantation, older than slavery, older than Louisiana itself. She was a messenger, nothing more. A tongue cut from her mouth couldn't stop the messages from coming, couldn't stop the truth from being written. In the main house, Adelaide Thornwood couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the girl, about that day 4 years ago, about the words that had spilled from Clara's mouth before Edmund had silenced her forever. "You took the medicine. You took it to stay thin." It was true, all of it. A tonic from a woman in New Orleans, something to prevent pregnancy, to keep her figure trim and fashionable. She'd known the risks. She'd taken it anyway. And when the baby came early, blue and still, she'd seen the judgment in Clara's eyes, even before the girl had spoken. Adelaide rose from her bed and walked to her vanity, lighting a candle. She studied her face in the mirror, still beautiful at 30, still admired at the society gatherings in New Orleans. She'd paid for that beauty in blood, in a small blue body wrapped in linen and buried in the family plot. She was reaching for her hairbrush when she noticed them. 3 small marks scratched into the gilded frame of her mirror. Fresh scratches, the gold leaf curled back to reveal the wood beneath. 3 crosses, arranged in a row. Adelaide's hand froze. Her reflection stared back at her, suddenly looking older, more fragile. She turned slowly, searching the room, but she was alone. The window was closed. The door was locked. 3 crosses, just like the ones on Garrett's door. Her heart began to pound in her chest, a rapid staccato that made her dizzy. She pressed her hand to her bodice, trying to slow her breathing, trying to calm the rising panic. It was nothing. Superstition, the work of a disturbed slave girl with a grudge. But deep down, in a place she didn't want to acknowledge, Adelaide Thornwood knew the truth. She had 3 days. 3 days to make peace with what she'd done, with who she was, with the life she'd built on top of that tiny blue body in the ground. Outside in the laundry house, Clara lay in the darkness and felt the message complete itself. Her lips moved without sound, forming words only the night could hear. What's written must be read. What's read must come to pass. The August heat pressed down on Ravenshade like a hand closing around a throat. In 3 days, something would break. And everyone on the plantation, from the master in his fine house to the slaves in their cramped quarters, could feel the pressure building, like the air before a Louisiana thunderstorm. Death had been announced. Now they could only wait to see who would answer its call. The morning after Adelaide Thornwood discovered the crosses on her mirror, the plantation woke to an oppressive stillness. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing, and the usual chatter of the enslaved people heading to the fields was muted, cautious. Something had shifted in the air at Ravenshade, something that made people walk a little faster, look over their shoulders a little more often. Adelaide didn't come down for breakfast. Master Thornwood ate alone in the dining room, his eggs and grits growing cold on the plate as he stared out the window toward the sugarcane fields. His wife had been hysterical the night before, babbling about marks on her mirror, about curses and prophecies. He'd given her laudanum to calm her nerves and sent her to bed, but her words had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Edmund Thornwood was not a superstitious man. He believed in profit margins and crop yields, in the power of discipline and the natural order of things. He'd built Ravenshade into one of the most productive plantations in St. James Parish through hard work and harder management. He had no patience for slave superstitions or voodoo nonsense, but 3 crosses on Garrett's door. 3 days later, Garrett was dead. Now 3 crosses on Adelaide's mirror. The coincidence was troubling. "Benjamin," he called to his house servant, a dignified man in his 50s who'd served the Thornwood family for 3 decades. "Bring me the girl, the mute one from the laundry house." Benjamin's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Clara, sir?" "Yes. Bring her here. Now." 20 minutes later, Clara stood in the dining room, her eyes downcast, her hands clasped in front of her stained apron. She was even smaller than Thornwood remembered, barely 5 feet tall, her frame bird-like and fragile. It was hard to believe this creature could inspire the kind of fear he'd been hearing whispered about in the quarters. "Look at me," Thornwood commanded. Clara raised her eyes slowly. They were dark and deep, and looking into them gave Thornwood the uncomfortable sensation of standing at the edge of a well, unable to see the bottom. "Did you mark my overseer's door?" he asked. 3 nights before he died?" Clara said nothing. She couldn't, of course, but her eyes held his gaze steadily, unblinking. "Did you mark my wife's mirror?" Still nothing. Just that steady, knowing stare. Thornwood felt his anger rising. "You will answer me. Nod or shake your head. Did you make those marks?" For a long moment Clara simply looked at him. Then slowly, deliberately, she nodded once. The admission should have been satisfying. It confirmed what he'd suspected, but instead, it made Thornwood's blood run cold. There was no defiance in her nod, no fear, no guilt, just acknowledgement, as if she were confirming that the sky was blue or water was wet. "Why?" he demanded. "What purpose does this serve? What are you trying to accomplish?" Clara tilted her head slightly, and for just a moment, something that might have been pity crossed her face. Then she lifted her hands and made a gesture, her right index finger drawing a line in the air, then another, forming invisible letters. "What is she doing?" Thornwood asked Benjamin, who stood by the door. "I believe she's trying to write something, sir, in the air." "Get her paper and a pencil." Benjamin quickly retrieved the items from Thornwood's study. Clara took them with steady hands and bent over the dining table. Her handwriting, when it came, was surprisingly elegant, the careful script of someone who'd been educated, perhaps before she'd come to Ravenshade. She wrote 4 words: "I only tell truth." Thornwood stared at the paper. What truth? That my overseer would die? That my wife... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Clara wrote again. "What is already written?" "Written by whom?" "By you." She shook her head and wrote, "I read what the dead write." The words sent a chill down Thornwood's spine. "That's nonsense. Voodoo superstition." Clara looked at him again with those bottomless eyes, then wrote one more line. 3 days. Like Mr. Garrett. I am sorry." Thornwood's face flushed red. "You're threatening my wife? You think you can curse her and I'll just let you—" But Clara was already shaking her head. She wrote quickly, "Not curse. Warning. Already decided. Not by me." "By whom, then?" Clara pointed upward, then downward, then placed her hand over her heart. The gesture was ambiguous. Heaven, hell, or something in between. Then she set down the pencil and stood waiting, her expression serene, almost peaceful. Thornwood wanted to have her whipped. He wanted to have her sold off to the worst plantation he could find, somewhere in the deep swamps where girls like her disappeared and no one asked questions. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the memory of what had happened to the man who'd tried to whip her after Garrett's death. William Moss, a field hand, pressed into temporary service as enforcer, who'd raised the whip and dropped dead before it could fall, his face purple, his eyes bulging, a stroke that came from nowhere. "Get out," Thornwood said finally, his voice tight. "Get back to your work, and stay away from my house. If I catch you near the main building again, I'll have you locked in the root cellar until I decide what to do with you." Clara nodded once, picked up her paper and pencil, and wrote one final message before leaving. "Root cellar has rats. They bite." As she walked out, Benjamin watched her go with an expression Thornwood couldn't quite read. "Sir," the house servant said quietly, "if I may speak freely." "What is it?" "The people in the quarters, they're saying Clara has a gift. That she can see things others can't. They're saying she knew about Mr. Garrett's death because she saw it in a dream, that the marks she makes are warnings, not curses." "And you believe that?" Benjamin was silent for a moment. "I believe there are things in this world that can't be explained by ledgers and crop reports, sir. I believe that girl has suffered greatly, and sometimes suffering opens doors in the mind that should stay closed. And I believe that Mistress Thornwood is very afraid, which is strange for a woman who fears nothing." Thornwood dismissed him with a wave. But alone in his dining room, he couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest. 3 days, Clara had written. 3 days, like Garrett. Upstairs, Adelaide Thornwood lay in her bed, the curtains drawn, her skin pale and clammy. She'd slept fitfully, plagued by dreams of a small blue baby that opened its eyes and stared at her with ancient accusation. When she'd finally woken, she'd been unable to eat, unable to think about anything except those 3 crosses on her mirror. Her maid, a young woman named Violet, tried to coax her to take some tea, some toast, anything, but Adelaide could only shake her head and stare at the ceiling. "Violet," she whispered, "do you believe in curses?" The maid's eyes widened. "Ma'am? That girl, Clara. They say she can predict death. Do you believe that?" Violet set down the tea tray carefully. She was perhaps 18, light-skinned, the daughter of one of the house servants and a white overseer long gone. "I believe Clara sees things, ma'am. Whether it's curse or gift, I don't know, but I know she marked Mr. Garrett's door, and Mr. Garrett died. And she's marked my mirror." "Yes, ma'am." Adelaide's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean for the baby to die, Violet. You have to believe me. I took the medicine because Edmund wanted me to stay beautiful, wanted to show me off at the parties in New Orleans. I didn't know it would—" Her voice broke. Violet sat carefully on the edge of the bed, a breach of protocol that Adelaide was too distraught to notice. "Clara don't make judgments, ma'am. Least that's what they say. She just marks what she sees, like a weather vane pointing where the wind blows." "Then why me? Why now? It's been 4 years." "Maybe," Violet said softly. "Maybe the wind's been blowing toward you all along, and it's only now reaching where you stand." Adelaide began to sob, deep, wrenching sounds that shook her whole body. Outside, the August sun beat down mercilessly, and in the laundry house Clara stood over a tub of steaming water, her hands moving mechanically through the dirty clothes, her mind far away. She could see it now, clearer than ever. 2 days and nights from now, Adelaide Thornwood would sit at the dinner table, laughing at something her husband said, trying to prove to herself that the marks meant nothing. She would take a bite of duck, and the laughter would stop. Her hand would go to her chest, her eyes would widen. She would try to speak, but no words would come. Poetic justice for a woman who'd silenced another. Her heart would simply stop, seized by guilt and fear and a lifetime of small cruelties wrapped in silk dresses and false smiles. She would fall forward onto her plate, and Master Thornwood would scream for help, but there would be nothing anyone could do. The dead had written her name in their book years ago, when a blue baby took its first and last breath in her arms. Clara didn't make these things happen. She simply read the signs and translated them for the living. The crosses were a courtesy, a warning that the living rarely gave each other. 3 days to prepare, to confess, to make peace. Some people used those 3 days. Most didn't. That evening, as the enslaved people of Ravenshade gathered for their meagre supper in the quarters, the talk was all about Clara and the mistress. Word had spread about the marks on Adelaide's mirror, about Clara being summoned to the main house, about the 3 days that had now become 2. "We should protect her," Samuel said, his voice low but firm. "If Mistress Adelaide dies and Master Thornwood thinks Clara killed her, he'll have her hanged or worse." "How do we protect her?" Ruth asked. "We can't even protect ourselves." "We say we saw Clara in the quarters all night," Samuel replied. "All of us. We say she was never near the main house. Whatever happens, Clara was with us." There were murmurs of agreement. Clara might be strange, might frighten them with her silent stares and her midnight wanderings, but she was one of them. And if her strange gift allowed her to strike at their oppressors, even indirectly, then she deserved their protection. In the main house, Edmund Thornwood sat in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on his desk. He was thinking about his wife, about the girl with no tongue, about the fragile order he'd built and maintained through force and fear. He was thinking about how quickly that order could collapse. The plantation had always been a tinderbox. He knew that. Every master knew that. You kept the slaves scared enough to obey, but not desperate enough to rebel. You maintained the fiction that the system was natural, ordained by God, unbreakable. But Clara threatened that fiction. She represented something the slaves could believe in, a power beyond the whip, beyond the overseer, beyond Master Thornwood himself. If Adelaide died as Garrett had died, exactly 3 days after Clara's marks appeared, the slaves would believe absolutely in Clara's power, and that belief could spread, could grow, could turn into something more dangerous than any rebellion. He couldn't allow that to happen. Thornwood made his decision. Tomorrow morning he would send Clara away. He'd sell her to a trader who worked the deep Mississippi plantations, places where slaves disappeared into the swamps and no one asked questions. He'd tell the other slaves she'd been punished for making threats, that her marks meant nothing, that Garrett's death had been pure coincidence, and if Adelaide died anyway, he'd make sure no one connected it to Clara. He'd say it was her heart, a natural weakness, a tragedy but nothing more. He'd rebuild the order, he'd maintain control. He took a long drink of whiskey, feeling it burn down his throat. Outside, fireflies danced in the heavy night air, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called out a lonely, mournful song. In the laundry house, Clara lay on her mattress and stared at the darkness. She could feel time moving like water, flowing toward an inevitable conclusion. 2 more days, 48 hours, until Adelaide Thornwood's heart stopped beating. And then what? Would Master Thornwood understand the message? Would any of them? Clara's lips moved in the darkness, forming words no one would ever hear. I don't bring death, I just read its letters. I'm not the storm, I'm just the one who smells the rain coming. Tomorrow would bring new fear, new anger, new attempts to silence what couldn't be silenced. But Clara had learned long ago that truth didn't need a voice to be heard. It just needed time. And time was something everyone at Ravenshade Plantation was running out of. Dawn broke over Ravenshade with a blood-red sky that made the old slaves shake their heads and mutter prayers. "Red sky at morning, sailor, take warning," Bessie said as she shuffled toward the laundry house, her joints aching with the damp that preceded rain. "Something bad's coming. I can feel it in my bones." She wasn't wrong. Master Thornwood had barely slept. He'd spent the night going over his ledgers, calculating the loss he'd take selling Clara mid-season versus the chaos her presence might cause. By first light, he'd made up his mind. The girl would be gone before noon. He sent Benjamin to fetch Silas Drummond, a slave trader who worked the river parishes. Drummond was known for asking few questions and remembering even less. He specialized in what he called difficult acquisitions, slaves with reputations, slaves who'd run or fought back, slaves who needed to disappear. While they waited for Drummond, Thornwood went upstairs to check on Adelaide. She was awake, sitting up in bed, but she looked like a ghost. Her skin had taken on a greyish pallor, and there were dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been there the day before. She barely touched the breakfast Violet brought her. "How are you feeling?" Thornwood asked, trying to keep the concern out of his voice. "Like I'm drowning," Adelaide whispered. "Like there's a weight on my chest and I can't breathe properly. Edmund, I'm frightened." He sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand. It was cold, despite the morning heat. "It's just anxiety, the mind playing tricks. I'm sending the girl away today. Once she's gone, you'll feel better. You'll see." But even as he spoke the words, he didn't believe them. Looking at his wife's face, at the way her eyes kept darting to the mirror with its 3 scratched crosses, he felt the first real stab of fear. What if Clara was right? What if something was going to happen in 2 days' time, regardless of where the girl was? He pushed the thought away angrily. He was Edmund Thornwood, master of Ravenshade, one of the wealthiest men in St. James Parish. He didn't bow to slave superstitions or fear marks scratched in mirror frames. He controlled life and death on this plantation, not some tongueless girl who'd probably lost her mind years ago. "Rest," he told Adelaide, squeezing her cold hand. "I'll handle everything." Down in the quarters, word had already spread that the master was sending for a trader. The enslaved community of Ravenshade fell into tense silence. Everyone knew what a trader meant. Someone was being sold, torn away from whatever fragile connections they'd managed to build in this place of brutality and sorrow. Samuel found Clara in the laundry house, scrubbing sheets with her usual mechanical precision. Ruth and Mary had left, too afraid to be near her when the master came calling. "Clara," Samuel said softly. She looked up at him with those dark, knowing eyes. They're sending you away. Traders coming for you today." Clara nodded slowly, unsurprised. She set down her washing and wiped her hands on her apron, then gestured for the paper and pencil she kept hidden in a corner of the laundry house. She wrote, "I know. Saw it last night." "You saw it? Like you see the other things?" Clara nodded and wrote more. "I will be sold to a man named Drummond. He will take me south to a plantation near New Iberia. I will work there for 11 months. Then I will be free." Samuel frowned. "Free? How can you know that?" Clara's expression became distant, as if she were seeing something beyond the wooden walls of the laundry house. She wrote, "Because 11 months from now, Drummond will be caught cheating at cards in Opelousas. He will be killed. His papers will burn. No one will know who owns me. I will walk away. And they'll just let you go? No one lets slaves go. But sometimes the chains break anyway." Samuel stared at the words, then at Clara's serene face. "Why don't you tell them this? Tell them you'll be gone anyway, that they don't need to—" Clara shook her head and wrote quickly, "Master Thornwood needs to feel he controls this. If I tell him I've already seen my freedom, he'll kill me to prove he controls my future. Men like him cannot tolerate knowing they're powerless. So you'll just let him sell you?" "I let nothing. I watch what unfolds." Samuel wanted to argue, wanted to rage against the unfairness of it all, but Clara's calm certainty deflated his anger. She'd already moved beyond this moment, beyond Ravenshade, beyond whatever Edmund Thornwood thought he could do to her. "What about Mistress Adelaide?" Samuel asked finally. "Will she really die tomorrow night?" Clara's face darkened slightly. She wrote, "Her heart is already dying. Has been since the baby. Guilt eats at the heart like rust eats iron. Tomorrow she will have one bite of duck and the rust will finally break through. Her heart will stop. The doctor will say it was sudden, unexpected, but I see the rust. I always see the rust." "And you can't stop it?" "I am not a healer. I am a reader. I read what's written in the space between life and death. What's written cannot be unwritten." Before Samuel could respond, they heard boots on the path outside. Master Thornwood's voice called out, "Clara, come out here now!" Clara stood calmly, smoothing her apron. She reached out and squeezed Samuel's hand once. Her fingers were cold, despite the heat. Then walked out into the bright morning sunlight. Thornwood stood there with 2 men. One was Silas Drummond, the trader, a heavy-set man with sweat stains under his arms and tobacco-stained teeth. The other was a constable from town, there to witness the transaction and ensure legality. "This is the one?" Drummond asked, looking Clara up and down like she was livestock. "She don't look like much." "She's strong enough," Thornwood said curtly. "Good worker, knows her place, no trouble with her." The lie hung in the air like smoke. Everyone knew there'd been plenty of trouble with Clara, just not the kind that left visible scars. "Why are you selling her then?" Drummond asked shrewdly. "Good workers are hard to come by." "Downsizing. Sugar prices aren't what they used to be." Another lie. But Drummond didn't care. He could see Thornwood wanted this girl gone quickly, which meant he could negotiate a low price. "I'll give you 400 for her. She's worth 700. She's worth what I'm willing to pay. And I'm willing to pay 400. They haggled for another 10 minutes, while Clara stood silently between them, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the plantation. Finally, they settled on $500, a fraction of what a healthy slave would normally cost, and both men knew it. Papers were signed. Money changed hands. The constable recorded the sale in his ledger, noting 1 female slave, mute, approximately 25 years of age, sold by Edmund Thornwood to Silas Drummond this day, August 24th, 1843. Drummond grabbed Clara's arm roughly. "Come on, girl. We got a long walk to the river." As they turned to leave, Clara looked back at Ravenshade one last time. Her eyes found Samuel in the group of enslaved people who'd gathered to watch. She mouthed 2 words he understood without hearing them: 2 days. Then she looked up at the main house. At the window where Adelaide Thornwood stood watching, her pale face barely visible behind the glass. Clara raised her hand and held up one finger, then two. 2 days. Adelaide stumbled back from the window, her hand flying to her chest. "Move along," Drummond growled, pulling Clara down the path toward the river road. As they walked, Clara could see the life unfolding before her like a map. She saw the plantation near New Iberia, where Drummond would sell her, a smaller place than Ravenshade, but no less cruel. She saw the work she'd do there, the people she'd meet, the woman named Josephine who'd teach her to use her hands to speak in signs instead of words. She saw Drummond in an Opelousas tavern, 11 months from now, his luck running out at the card table, a knife flashing in lamplight. She saw his papers burning in the tavern fire that would follow, her name turning to ash, her chains turned to smoke. And she saw herself walking north, following the river, guided by stars and signs only she could read. Freedom wasn't given, it was taken when the moment revealed itself, and her moment was coming. But before that moment, other things had to unfold. Adelaide Thornwood had to keep her appointment with death. Ravenshade had to learn that some things couldn't be controlled by whips and chains and forced sails. The scales had to balance. They reached the river by late morning. A flatboat was waiting, and Drummond pushed Clara aboard with 3 other slaves he'd acquired that week. 2 men and a teenage girl, all of them looking hollow-eyed and defeated. As the boat pushed off from the shore, Clara looked back at St. James Parish. She could still see Ravenshade in the distance, the white main house gleaming in the sun like a painted sepulchre. Tomorrow night, that house would echo with screams as Adelaide Thornwood clutched her chest and fell forward onto her dinner plate. The day after, Master Thornwood would bury his wife and rage at the universe for taking her from him, never understanding that he'd helped dig her grave the day he'd cut out Clara's tongue. What's written must be read, Clara thought, her lips moving soundlessly. And what's read must come to pass. The boat drifted south, following the brown water of the Mississippi toward New Iberia, toward 11 months of waiting, toward a freedom that existed just beyond the visible horizon. Clara closed her eyes and felt the sun on her face, felt the river rocking beneath her, felt the weight of prophecy settling into her bones. She was not a witch, she was not a curse. She was simply a woman who could read the writing on walls no one else could see, the walls between this world and whatever waited beyond it. And those walls were covered in names, dates, moments of ending written in invisible ink that only she could decipher. Adelaide Thornwood's name was written there. So was Edmund Thornwood's, though his date was still many years away. So were the names of everyone at Ravenshade, everyone on this boat, everyone in Louisiana and beyond. Death was a patient scribe, and its book had infinite pages. Clara had learned to read that book the day they cut her tongue. The pain had split her open, and through that split, other knowledge had come flooding in. She'd tried to close herself to it, tried to return to silence and ignorance, but the knowing wouldn't stop. It came in dreams, in waking visions, in sudden certainties that dropped into her mind like stones into still water. At first she'd thought she was going mad, but madness didn't see the future with such accuracy. Madness couldn't predict Garrett's death 3 days before it happened, couldn't see the precise moment when Adelaide Thornwood's guilt-corroded heart would finally give out. No, this wasn't madness. This was something else. A gift or a curse, depending on perspective. A burden either way. "You got a name, girl?" one of the male slaves asked her. He was perhaps 30, with scars on his back visible through his torn shirt. Clara nodded and pointed to herself, then made a signing motion, the letter C drawn in the air. "Can't talk?" She shook her head. "That's all right," the man said kindly. "I'm Moses. This here's Jacob, and that's Penny." He gestured to the other 2 slaves. "We're all headed south to God knows what. Might as well know each other's names on the journey." Clara smiled slightly and nodded. She liked Moses already. There was a gentleness in his eyes, despite the scars on his back, a humanity that slavery hadn't yet beaten out of him. Drummond ignored them all, sitting at the front of the flatboat and spitting tobacco juice into the river. He was counting his money, pleased with his day's work. 5 slaves acquired in one morning, all of them for reasonable prices. He'd make a good profit selling them to the plantations around New Iberia. He had no idea that in 11 months, Clara would be the only one of these 5 who would still be alive. Jacob would die of fever in 6 weeks. Penny would be worked to death in the cane fields by February. Moses would be killed trying to run in April. And Drummond himself would bleed out on a tavern floor in July, his final thoughts confused and disbelieving. But Clara knew. Clara saw. And there was nothing she could do to change any of it. She could only watch it unfold, could only mark the passages and warn those who might listen. Most didn't listen. Most couldn't bear to know. As the flatboat drifted south under the August sun, Clara closed her eyes and thought about Ravenshade. She thought about Ruth and Mary and Bessie, about Samuel with his kind eyes, about Benjamin the house servant who'd shown her small dignities when no one else would. She thought about Edmund Thornwood and his ledgers, his careful calculations of profit and loss, never understanding that some debts couldn't be tallied in his books. And she thought about Adelaide, lying in her bed right now, feeling the weight on her chest growing heavier, feeling time running out like sand through an hourglass. 24 hours from now, Adelaide would be dead. And nothing, not prayer, not medicine, not selling Clara to a trader, would change that. The river flowed on, carrying them all toward their appointed destinies. Some futures could be changed, Clara knew. Small moments could be altered by choice and will. But the big moments, the ones written in deep ink, those were fixed. Those were the appointments no one could break. All she could do was read them and report them, the messenger bearing news no one wanted to hear. The sun climbed higher, and the day grew hotter, and the flatboat drifted south toward New Iberia, while behind them, at Ravenshade Plantation, the clock continued its inexorable counting down toward Adelaide Thornwood's final dinner. The evening after Clara's departure, Ravenshade felt different. The enslaved people moved through their work with unusual quietness, speaking in whispers, glancing frequently toward the main house, where Adelaide Thornwood remained sequestered in her room. Even the livestock seemed unsettled. The horses nickered nervously in their stalls, and the hounds paced restlessly in their kennels. Samuel couldn't shake the image of Clara being led away by Drummond, couldn't forget the words she'd written. 2 days. Now it was down to 1 day. Tomorrow night, if Clara's vision held true, the mistress would die. In the main house, Edmund Thornwood sat in his study trying to focus on plantation accounts, but the numbers swam before his eyes. He'd done the right thing selling Clara, he told himself. She'd been a disruptive influence, spreading superstitious fear among the slaves. With her gone, things would return to normal, but upstairs Adelaide's condition had worsened noticeably. She'd managed to come down for dinner the previous night, but tonight she'd refused, saying she felt too weak. The doctor from town had been called, Dr. Matthias Carver, a portly man with mutton-chop whiskers who smelled perpetually of pipe tobacco. Carver examined Adelaide thoroughly, listening to her heart, checking her pulse, asking about her symptoms. When he came back downstairs, his expression was troubled. "Well?" Thornwood demanded. "What's wrong with her?" "Her heart is racing irregularly," Carver said, setting down his black bag, "and her pulse is weak. Has she been under unusual stress lately?" Thornwood hesitated. "She's been anxious. About some nonsense one of the slaves told her." "What sort of nonsense?" "Superstitious threats. I've dealt with it. The slave in question has been sold and removed from the property." Carver frowned. "Edmund, I'm going to speak plainly. Your wife is exhibiting symptoms of severe anxiety that may be affecting her heart. The mind and body are connected in ways we're only beginning to understand. If Adelaide believes something terrible is going to happen to her, that belief itself can manifest physical symptoms." Are you saying she's making herself sick?" I'm saying that fear can kill as surely as poison. She needs rest, calm reassurance, and perhaps a mild sedative. I'll leave laudanum for her to take before bed. But Edmund, you need to address whatever has frightened her so badly. Find the root of her fear and pull it out. After Carver left, Thornwood went upstairs. Adelaide was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, her breathing shallow. The 3 crosses scratched into her mirror frame seemed to mock him from across the room. The doctor says you need to rest, Thornwood said, sitting beside her. And stop worrying about that girl's marks. She's gone now, far away. She can't hurt you. It's not her I'm afraid of, Adelaide whispered. It's what she knew. Edmund, she was right about Garrett. Down to the day. What if she's right about me? She guessed, that's all. Garrett's death was an accident. Was it? Adelaide turned to look at him and her eyes were wild. Or did that girl see something we can't? Maybe she didn't cause it, but she saw it coming, like a storm cloud before rain. And if she saw Garrett's death and she saw mine... Her voice broke. Tomorrow is the 3rd day, Edmund, tomorrow. Thornwood wanted to rage at her, to shake her, to make her see reason. But looking at his wife's terrified face, he felt his certainty wavering. What if the girl had seen something? What if there was some truth to the whispers in the quarters about Clara's strange gift? No, he refused to believe it. There was no such thing as prophecy or second sight. There was only coincidence and superstition and the human tendency to see patterns where none existed. Nothing is going to happen tomorrow, he said firmly. We'll have a normal dinner, just like always. You'll see. The 3rd day will pass like any other, and you'll realize you've been frightening yourself over nothing. But his words sounded hollow, even to his own ears. That night, neither of them slept well. Adelaide tossed and turned, crying out from nightmares she couldn't remember upon waking. Thornwood lay beside her, staring into the darkness, thinking about the girl with no tongue and eyes that saw too much. By morning, Adelaide looked like she'd aged 10 years, but she was determined not to let fear rule her. I won't hide in my room like a coward, she announced at breakfast, though she ate nothing. If this is truly my last day, I'll spend it living, not cowering. She had Violet dress her in her finest gown, deep blue silk with lace at the collar. She put on the sapphire necklace Edmund had given her on their 5th anniversary. She had her hair arranged in elaborate curls. If death was coming for her tonight, she would meet it looking like the lady she'd always strived to be. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Adelaide occupied herself with small tasks, arranging flowers in vases, reviewing menus with the cook, writing letters to friends in New Orleans that she didn't mail. Every hour that passed felt like both victory and countdown. She was still alive, but the appointed time drew closer. In the quarters, the enslaved people of Ravenshade went about their work, but everyone was aware of the significance of the day. Samuel found excuses to work near the main house, watching the windows for any sign of disturbance. Ruth and Mary whispered prayers between their laundry tasks. Bessie, who'd seen more than most in her 70-odd years, simply shook her head and said, "What's meant to be will be. No running from that." Dessous, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Adelaide felt the weight on her chest growing heavier. It was harder to breathe now, harder to focus. Her hands trembled as Violet helped her to the dining room. The evening meal had been prepared with special care. The cook, a woman named Martha who'd worked at Ravenshade for 20 years, had made all of Adelaide's favorites: turtle soup, roasted duck with orange glaze, sweet potatoes candied with molasses, butter beans, cornbread, and peach cobbler for dessert. Thornwood joined his wife at the table, determined to make this meal normal, unremarkable, proof that Clara's marks had meant nothing. Benjamin served the courses with his usual dignified efficiency, though Samuel, watching from the kitchen doorway, could see the tension in the older man's shoulders. They started with the soup. Adelaide managed a few spoonfuls, though her hand shook slightly. Thornwood tried to make conversation about the sugar harvest, about plans for the coming season, anything to distract from the unspoken fear hanging over the table. Then came the duck, perfectly roasted, the skin crispy and golden, the meat tender and rich. Martha had outdone herself. Thornwood cut into his portion enthusiastically. "This is excellent," he said to Adelaide. "You must try it." Adelaide looked down at her plate. The duck sat there, gleaming with glaze, steam rising from the meat. She picked up her knife and fork. Her hands were steadier now, almost steady enough to convince herself that she'd been foolish, that nothing was going to happen, that Clara had been wrong. She cut a small piece of duck. She brought it to her mouth. She took a bite. The meat was delicious, savory and sweet, perfectly cooked. She chewed slowly, and for just a moment she felt relief flooding through her. She was fine. The third day was passing. Clara had been wrong. It was all superstition, and the pain hit like lightning, striking her chest. Adelaide's fork clattered to her plate. Her hand flew to her bodice, clutching at the fabric over her heart. Her eyes went wide with shock and terror. "Adelaide!" Thornwood half rose from his chair. "What's wrong?" She tried to speak, but no words came out. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, just as Clara's had done 4 years ago in this very house. The irony of it would have struck her as profound if she'd had the capacity to think. But she couldn't think. She could only feel the crushing agony in her chest, feel her heart stuttering and skipping, feel her lungs refusing to draw air. "Adelaide!" Thornwood was shouting now. "Benjamin, get the doctor! Someone help!" Adelaide slumped forward, her face going into her plate, her carefully arranged curls coming undone. The sapphire necklace glittered at her throat. Her hands twitched once, twice, then went still. Benjamin rushed to her side, putting his fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. His face went pale. "Sir, I think she's gone." "No." Thornwood pulled Adelaide upright, shaking her. "No, she's not gone, she's just fainted. Adelaide, wake up, wake up." But Adelaide Thornwood would never wake up. Her heart, corroded by 4 years of guilt, weakened by 3 days of terror, had finally given out. She was 30 years old, and she died exactly as Clara had predicted. 3 days after the marks appeared, with one bite of duck on her lips, her face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The household erupted into chaos. Servants ran for the doctor, though everyone knew it was too late. Thornwood cradled his wife's body, disbelief warring with rage on his face. The cook, Martha, stood in the kitchen doorway, tears streaming down her face, not for the mistress, but for the sheer terrible accuracy of Clara's prophecy. In the quarters, Samuel heard the screaming from the main house. He closed his eyes and whispered, "3 days, just like she said." Dr. Carver arrived within the hour and confirmed what everyone already knew. Adelaide had suffered what he called acute cardiac arrest. Her heart had simply stopped. "These things happen," he said to the devastated Edmund Thornwood. "Sometimes the heart gives out without warning. There was nothing anyone could have done." But Thornwood knew better. He thought about the marks on the mirror, about Clara's calm certainty, about the 3 days that had counted down to this exact moment. The girl had known. She'd known to the day, to the meal, to the bite. How? How was it possible? As the night wore on, and the undertaker came to prepare Adelaide's body, as the house was draped in black and messages were sent to relatives in New Orleans, Thornwood sat in his study and faced a truth he'd spent his entire life denying. There were forces in this world beyond his control. There were things that couldn't be managed with money or violence or careful planning. Clara hadn't caused his wife's death. She'd simply read the signs that were already there, written in a language only she could understand. And by sending her away, by trying to silence the messenger, he'd accomplished nothing except proving his own impotence. The realization burned like acid in his gut. In the quarters, the enslaved people of Ravenshade gathered in the darkness, speaking in hushed tones. Clara's prophecy had come true, exactly as she'd said it would. The mute girl who'd been sold away had proven more powerful than the master in his fine house, more powerful than the overseer with his whip, more powerful than any of them had dared to imagine. She marked the door, and death came knocking, Ruth whispered. She's like one of them old prophets in the Bible, speaking truth without a tongue. Maybe she's an angel, Mary suggested, come to deliver judgment on the wicked. She ain't no angel, Bessie said firmly. She's just a girl who can see what others can't. A gift and a curse both, but she was right. She was right about everything. Samuel thought about Clara on that flatboat, heading south with Drummond. He wondered if she knew, even now, that her prophecy had come to pass. He suspected she did. She'd probably known the exact moment Adelaide's heart would stop, had felt it somehow across the miles. The thought should have frightened him, but instead it gave him strange comfort. If Clara could see the future, if she could mark the doors of those who deserved judgment, then maybe there was hope. Maybe the powerful weren't as powerful as they seemed. Maybe there was a reckoning coming that no amount of money or violence could prevent. In his study, Thornwood poured himself another whiskey and stared at nothing. Tomorrow he would bury his wife. Next week he would hire a new overseer to replace Garrett. He would continue running Ravenshade as he always had, maintaining order through fear and force, but something had broken inside him tonight. Some certainty had cracked. And through that crack, doubt began to seep in like water through a ship's hull. He thought about the paper Clara had written on, "I only tell truth, what is already written." If that was true, if there really was a book somewhere with all their fates already recorded, then what was the point of anything? What was the point of trying to control or plan or build if it was all already decided? The whiskey offered no answers. Neither did the darkness outside his window. So Thornwood sat alone in his study, a master in his domain, surrounded by wealth built on suffering, and for the first time in his life, he felt utterly powerless. Upstairs, in the room where Adelaide had died, Violet was preparing the body for viewing. As she worked, she noticed the 3 crosses scratched into the mirror frame. On impulse, she took a cloth and carefully wiped away the marks, erasing them as if they'd never existed. But some things, once written, can never be truly erased. Clara's prophecy had been fulfilled. And somewhere in Louisiana, on a flatboat drifting through the dark, a woman with no tongue slept peacefully, her lips moving in dreams, reading words written in a language of blood and bones and inevitable endings. The 3rd day had passed, the account was settled, and at Ravenshade Plantation the slaves went to sleep that night, whispering a name like a prayer, like a promise, like a warning to all those who thought they could escape what was already written: Clara. The mute girl who spoke truth louder than any voice. 3 months passed. Autumn came to Louisiana, bringing cooler temperatures and relief from the brutal summer heat. The sugarcane grew tall and ready for harvest, and at Ravenshade Plantation, life continued its brutal routine under the supervision of a new overseer, a man named Frank Delaney, who was, if possible, even crueler than Garrett had been. Edmund Thornwood had changed since Adelaide's death. He'd grown thinner, harder, more prone to sudden rages. He threw himself into work, driving the slaves harder than ever, as if brutal efficiency could fill the hollow space his wife's death had left. He never spoke of Adelaide, never mentioned Clara, never acknowledged the prophecy that had come true exactly as predicted. But in private moments, late at night in his study, the doubt continued to gnaw at him. He'd started keeping a journal, writing down strange occurrences, patterns he noticed, trying to find some rational explanation for what had happened. But the more he wrote, the more he had to confront an uncomfortable truth. Clara had seen something real. She'd known things that were impossible to know. The question that haunted him was, what else had she seen? What other futures had she glimpsed? And did those futures include him? Down in the quarters, Clara had become something of a legend. The enslaved people of Ravenshade told her story to the newer arrivals, embellishing it with each retelling. She became the mute prophetess, the silent oracle, the woman who could mark your door and seal your fate. Some said she'd been a queen in Africa before being captured. Others claimed she'd been born under a blood moon, with a veil over her face. The truth, that she'd simply been a girl whose suffering had opened her to visions, was less dramatic, but more profound. Samuel often thought about Clara, wondered where she was, if she was safe, if her vision about freedom had come true. He'd taken to visiting the laundry house sometimes, standing in the space where she'd worked, remembering her silent presence and her terrible gift. It was during one of these visits that he noticed something carved into the wooden wall near where Clara had slept. At first, he thought it was just random scratches, but looking closer, he realized they were words carefully etched into the wood. "Before I go, I see 7 more marks at Ravenshade. 3 have already fallen. 4 remain. The master's name is written last. Samuel's blood ran cold. 3 have already fallen. Garrett, Adelaide, and who else?" Then he remembered. William Moss, the man who'd tried to whip Clara and dropped dead of a stroke. 3 deaths, and Clara had seen 7 total. 4 more to come, with the master's name written last. Samuel debated whether to tell anyone. Such knowledge was dangerous. If Thornwood found out that Clara had predicted his death, there was no telling what he might do. But the other enslaved people deserved to know, deserved to understand, that Clara's visions hadn't ended with Adelaide's death. That evening, Samuel gathered a small group of trusted people in his cabin. Ruth, Mary, Bessie, Benjamin, and a few others. He told them what he'd found carved in the laundry house wall. 7 marks, Bessie repeated slowly. 3 done, 4 to go, and the master last. She let out a long breath. "Lord, have mercy." "Do we know who the other 4 are?" Mary asked. "Maybe Delaney," Ruth suggested. "That man's got cruelty written all over him. Wouldn't be surprised if death comes for him next." "We shouldn't talk about this," Benjamin said quietly. He was older, more cautious, had survived decades at Ravenshade by keeping his head down. If Master Thornwood hears even a whisper that we're discussing his death, he'll have us all whipped or worse. "But if Clara saw it," Samuel argued, "then it's going to happen regardless of what we say or don't say. Her visions come true. We've seen it." "That's what frightens me," Benjamin admitted, "because if she saw Master Thornwood's death, then she probably saw how we all fit into it. And I don't want to be part of whatever brings about a master's death, even if that master deserves it." The group fell silent, contemplating the implications. If Thornwood died, what would happen to Ravenshade? Would they all be sold off to different plantations, families separated? Would there be investigations, accusations, violence? Meanwhile, hundreds of miles south in New Iberia, Clara was indeed living the life she'd foreseen. The plantation where Drummond had sold her was called Sweetwater, a smaller operation than Ravenshade, but no less demanding. She worked in the house here, cleaning and serving, and true to her vision, she'd met a woman named Josephine, a free woman of color who came weekly to sell vegetables to the plantation. Josephine had immediately recognized something special in Clara. She'd begun teaching her sign language, a system of hand gestures used by deaf people to communicate. Clara took to it naturally, her hands forming words and concepts with increasing fluency. For the first time since her tongue was cut, she could truly communicate beyond simple gestures and scrawled notes. "You have a gift," Josephine told her one day, her hands moving in signs. "Not just for learning signs, I mean the other gift, the seeing." Clara's eyes widened. She signed back. "You know about that?" "I can tell. It's in your eyes. You look at people like you're reading a book only you can see. My grandmother had the same gift. She called it walking between this world and the next, seeing both at once." "Is there a way to stop it?" Clara signed. "Sometimes I don't want to see." Josephine shook her head. "Would you want to be blind when you could see? This is the same. You've been given eyes that see more. You can close them maybe, but the visions will come anyway. Better to accept it, learn to live with it." I've seen terrible things, I imagine you have. But you've also warned people, given them time to prepare. That's mercy, even if they don't recognize it. Clara thought about Adelaide Thornwood, about those 3 days of warning. Had it been mercy, or had it been cruelty, forcing someone to live with the knowledge of their approaching death? She still wasn't sure. As the weeks passed, Clara's visions continued. She saw the overseer at Sweetwater falling from a horse and breaking his neck. It happened 2 weeks later, exactly as she'd seen it. She saw one of the house slaves giving birth to twins. It happened a month after that. She saw Drummond's death in an Opelousas tavern, saw the knife and the fire and the burning papers that would free her. She marked none of these visions. She carved no crosses, wrote no warnings. She simply watched them unfold, learning to distinguish between futures that were fixed and futures that might still change. Most were fixed. But occasionally, very rarely, she saw moments where choice still mattered, where someone could step left instead of right and change everything. Those moments were precious. Those were the ones where her warnings might actually help. Back at Ravenshade, the 4th mark came in November. Delaney, the new overseer, had been working a group of slaves in the cane fields when he suddenly clutched his chest and fell face first into the mud. By the time they got him back to the plantation house, he was dead. The doctor called it heart failure, same as Adelaide. He was 42 years old and had seemed perfectly healthy that morning. The enslaved people of Ravenshade knew better. This was number 4, 3 more to go, with Thornwood last. The master himself seemed to realize something was wrong. After Delaney's death, he became almost paranoid. He hired guards to watch the plantation at night. He had every slave's cabin searched for anything that might be used to cause harm. Herbs, powders, strange symbols. He found nothing, of course. Clara's marks had never been physical weapons. He also began drinking heavily, sitting up late in his study, going through old papers, old records. It was during one of these drunken nights that he found something that made his blood run cold. It was the bill of sale for Clara, the document Drummond had signed taking ownership of her. But Thornwood had kept a copy, and on the back of that copy, in handwriting he now recognized as Clara's from the notes she'd written, were 7 names: James Garrett, Adelaide Thornwood, William Moss, Frank Delaney. 3 names scratched out, illegible: Edmund Thornwood. His own name written clearly at the bottom of the list. She'd known. Before she was sold, before Delaney was even hired, she'd seen all 7 deaths. She'd seen the order they would come in. Thornwood stared at the list, his hands shaking. 4 names had already been crossed off by fate itself. 3 remained, including his own. Who were the other 2? He tried to read the scratched-out names, but Clara had deliberately obscured them, perhaps knowing he'd find this list someday. The smart thing would be to burn the paper, to destroy this evidence of prophecy, but Thornwood found he couldn't. Instead, he locked it in his desk drawer, as if keeping it close might somehow change what it predicted. December came, and with it, the 5th mark. One of the house servants, a young man named Thomas, who'd always been reliable and hard-working, was found dead in his bed one morning. No marks on him, no signs of violence. The doctor shrugged and said his heart must have stopped in his sleep. He was only 28. But Samuel, cleaning out Thomas's belongings, found 3 crosses carved into the underside of Thomas's cabin door, marks that could only be seen if you lifted the door slightly. Someone had marked Thomas's death, just as Clara had marked Garrett's and Adelaide's. Who made these marks? Samuel wondered aloud. Clara's been gone for months. Bessie, helping him, said quietly, "Maybe Clara made them before she left. Maybe she marked all 7 while she was still here, and we're only finding them now as death comes calling." The thought was chilling. Clara might have marked every death before she was sold, leaving crosses hidden all over Ravenshade, time bombs of prophecy waiting to be discovered. Samuel went searching. He checked doors, walls, floorboards, and he found them. 3 crosses carved into the underside of the feed trough in the barn. 3 crosses scratched into a support beam in the main house cellar. each set of marks presumably corresponding to one of the remaining deaths Clara had foreseen. He found the third set of marks on the back of a portrait in Thornwood's study, a portrait of Adelaide that the master couldn't bear to look at anymore and had turned to face the wall. 3 crosses carved into the wooden frame. Thornwood himself, Samuel realized, with growing dread. One of the remaining marks was for Thornwood. But which door or wall or object carried his death mark? Or had Clara marked him differently, knowing he might find and destroy any obvious signs? The answer came in January. Thornwood had been restless all day, unable to focus on work. That evening he went to his study and poured himself a whiskey. As he raised the glass to his lips, he noticed something that made him freeze. 3 small crosses, scratched into the bottom of the whiskey glass itself. So faint he'd never noticed them before, but visible now when held up to the lamplight. How long had they been there? How many times had he drunk from this glass, marked with his own death? The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. Thornwood stared at the broken pieces, his heart hammering in his chest. This was it. His mark. Clara had known which glass he favoured, had carved her prophecy into something he would touch every single night. How much time did he have? Days? Weeks? Months? He spent that night going through every item in his study, every glass and pen and book, looking for more marks. He found none. Just the broken whiskey glass on the floor, its 3 crosses glittering in the lamplight like tiny promises. Outside, Samuel watched the light burning in the master's window and wondered how many more deaths Ravenshade would see before Clara's prophecy was complete. 2 more, according to the list. And then Thornwood himself. The waiting was almost worse than the dying. At least death was quick, but this slow countdown, this knowledge that something terrible was coming but not knowing when or how, this was its own kind of torture. Clara had given them all a gift and a curse, the truth of what was coming, and as Ravenshade Plantation moved deeper into winter, that truth hung over them all like a sword suspended by a thread, waiting for gravity to do its inevitable work. Winter deepened over Louisiana, and with it came a cold that settled into the bones of everyone at Ravenshade. It wasn't the brutal cold of northern states, but a damp, creeping chill that made the nights unbearable in the slave quarters and turned the red clay to slippery mud. The 6th death came in February, and it was perhaps the most shocking of all. Benjamin, the dignified house servant who'd served the Thornwood family for 30 years, was found dead at the bottom of the main staircase. His neck was broken from the fall. Everyone assumed it had been an accident. The stairs were steep, and Benjamin had been carrying a heavy tray of silver that morning. Perhaps he'd simply lost his footing. But Samuel knew better. He'd checked Benjamin's cabin after the funeral, and there they were, 3 small crosses carved into the underside of Benjamin's Bible, the one possession the old man had treasured above all others. Clara had marked him months ago, before she'd even been sold. The enslaved community of Ravenshade was devastated. Benjamin had been their rock, their voice of wisdom and calm. If death could come for someone as good and careful as Benjamin, then none of them were safe. Thornwood, meanwhile, was coming apart at the seams. He'd stopped eating regularly, stopped maintaining his appearance. His hair had gone grey seemingly overnight. He spent hours in his study, staring at that list of names, at his own name written at the bottom in Clara's neat script. 6 down, 1 more, then him. But who was the 7th? He'd tried to read those scratched-out names 100 times, held the paper up to different lights, used magnifying glasses, but Clara had obscured them too thoroughly. All he knew was that one more person at Ravenshade had to die before death came for him. The paranoia ate at him like acid. Every day he woke up and wondered, is this the day I learn who number 7 is? Is it today that the last barrier between me and death falls? He began avoiding people, terrified that he might somehow cause the 7th death himself. He stopped going into town, stopped receiving visitors, stopped attending church. Ravenshade became his prison, and he, its sole inmate, serving a sentence handed down by a mute girl with eyes that saw too much. March arrived with unseasonable warmth. The sugarcane was being planted for the new season, and the plantation should have been bustling with activity. But there was a pall over everything now, a sense of waiting for something terrible to complete itself. It was Samuel who finally figured out the identity of the seventh name. He'd been thinking about the pattern of deaths: Garrett, the brutal overseer; Adelaide, the guilty mistress; Moss, the man who'd tried to hurt Clara; Delaney, another cruel overseer; Thomas. And here Samuel had to search his memory. What had Thomas done? Then he remembered. Thomas had been there that day in 1839. He'd been young, maybe 15, working as a house slave. He'd been the one who held Adelaide down while the midwife tried to save the baby. And afterward, Thomas had spread rumors about what Clara had said, had mocked her, had laughed about the punishment she'd received. Each person marked by Clara had wronged her in some way, or had been complicit in the cruelty of Ravenshade. Even Benjamin, Samuel realized with sadness, had been there that day. Benjamin had been the one who'd fetched Master Thornwood when Clara spoke. He'd set the machinery of her mutilation in motion, even if he'd done it simply following orders. Clara wasn't just predicting random deaths. She was marking those who'd harmed her, those who'd participated in or benefited from her suffering, which meant the seventh name could only be one person. Samuel went to the main house and asked to speak with the master. Thornwood, haggard and desperate, agreed immediately. "I know who the seventh is," Samuel said without preamble. "It's you." Thornwood's face went white. "That's impossible. I'm the last name. There's supposed to be one more before me." "Look at the list again, sir. Really look at it." With shaking hands, Thornwood pulled out the paper. Samuel pointed to the scratched-out names. "Those aren't names, sir. That's one name, scratched out over and over. Your name. She wrote it 7 times total, once for each mark. You're not just the last death at Ravenshade. You're all the deaths. Every mark was for you." The words hung in the air like smoke. Thornwood stared at the paper, and suddenly he could see it. The length of the scratched-out sections matched his name perfectly. Edmund Thornwood, written 3 times and deliberately obscured, creating the illusion of 3 separate victims. "She played me," Thornwood whispered. "She made me think there was time, made me think others would die first. But it's all been counting down to me. Everyone who died was connected to me, extensions of me. Garrett worked for me. Adelaide was my wife. Delaney was my employee. Benjamin was my servant. She wasn't marking 7 different people. She was showing me 7 facets of my own guilt." He looked up at Samuel with wild eyes. "How long do I have? When does it happen?" Samuel shook his head slowly. "I don't know, sir. But if I had to guess, soon. Very soon." That night, Thornwood couldn't sleep. He paced his study, going over every decision he'd made, every cruelty he'd sanctioned, every time he'd chosen profit over humanity. The weight of it was crushing. He thought about the day he'd cut out Clara's tongue. He remembered her screams, remembered the blood, remembered the satisfaction he'd felt at silencing someone who dared to speak truth about his wife. He'd thought he was maintaining order, protecting his family's reputation, but what he'd really been doing was trying to destroy evidence of his own moral bankruptcy. And Clara had seen it all, had seen past the moment, seen the ripples spreading outward, seen the inevitable reckoning that would come. As dawn broke on March 15th, 1844, Thornwood made a decision. He would go find Clara. He would travel to New Iberia, find Drummond, track down wherever the girl had been sold. He would make her undo whatever curse she'd placed on him. He packed a bag and prepared his horse, but as he was about to mount, he felt a sudden pressure in his chest. Not pain, exactly, just a heaviness, like someone had placed a stone on his heart. He tried to ignore it, tried to pull himself up into the saddle, but the pressure increased, became pain, became agony. He stumbled, clutching at the horse's mane, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Samuel, who'd been watching from the quarters, ran forward. "Master Thornwood, sir!" Thornwood looked up at him, and Samuel saw recognition in those eyes. Recognition that this was it, that Clara's prophecy was completing itself, that all the marks had been leading to this moment. "Tell her," Thornwood gasped. "Tell her she was right. Tell her I'm sorry." Then Edmund Thornwood, master of Ravenshade Plantation, one of the wealthiest men in St. James Parish, collapsed onto the red Louisiana clay he'd built his empire on. His heart, like Adelaide's before him, simply stopped. The doctor would later call it cardiac arrest, brought on by stress and exhaustion. But everyone at Ravenshade knew the truth. This was the seventh mark, the final prophecy fulfilled. News of Thornwood's death spread quickly. The plantation was thrown into chaos. Without a master, without an overseer, without anyone clearly in charge, the rigid hierarchy of Ravenshade began to collapse, and in that chaos, Samuel made a decision. He gathered the enslaved people of Ravenshade and told them, "We can run. Now, while there's confusion, while no one knows what's happening, we can run, and maybe some of us will make it to freedom." Not everyone went. Some were too old, too sick, too frightened of what lay beyond the plantation's boundaries. But Samuel led a group of 12, Ruth, Mary, and 10 others, north toward the Free States, following the stars and the stories passed down about underground railroads and safe houses. They made it 3 days before slave catchers found them. Ruth and Mary were caught. 2 others were killed resisting, but Samuel and 7 others escaped into the swamps, disappeared into the cypress and Spanish moss, and were never seen again. Whether they made it to freedom or died in those dark waters, no one ever knew. Ravenshade Plantation was sold at auction 6 weeks after Thornwood's death. His cousins from New Orleans inherited it, but never lived there. The place had a reputation now, a dark history that clung to it like the humidity. It was said to be cursed, haunted by a mute prophetess who could mark your door and seal your fate. The new owners tried to run it for 2 years, but nothing went right. Crops failed. Equipment broke. Workers died of mysterious accidents. By 1846, Ravenshade was abandoned, left to rot in the Louisiana heat. And far to the south, in a tavern in Opelousas on a hot July night in 1844, Silas Drummond sat at a card table, his luck running out. He'd been cheating, and the other players had finally figured it out. Voices were raised. A knife was drawn. Drummond died on that tavern floor, blood spreading across the wooden boards, his final thoughts confused and disbelieving. In the chaos that followed, fire broke out. Whether accidentally or deliberately, no one could say. The tavern burned to the ground, and with it, all of Drummond's papers. His ledgers, his bills of sale, his records of every slave he'd bought and sold, all turned to ash, including the papers that said Silas Drummond owned a mute slave woman named Clara. When the fire died down, and the bodies were counted, and the surviving slaves were rounded up, Clara was nowhere to be found. She'd simply walked away in the confusion, had followed the roads north as she'd always known she would, guided by visions that showed her which paths were safe and which were deadly. Josephine helped her, giving her food and clothes and letters of introduction to other free people of color who might shelter a runaway. Clara traveled at night, slept during the day, avoided towns and main roads. She used her gift to stay ahead of danger, reading the signs that told her when slave catchers were near, when it was safe to move, when she needed to hide. It took her 3 months to reach the north. 3 months of walking and hiding, of hunger and fear and determination. She made it to Philadelphia in October of 1844, carried by nothing but her own will and the visions that had never steered her wrong. In Philadelphia, she found work with a Quaker family who asked no questions about her past and accepted her sign language as her voice. She lived quietly, keeping her gift mostly to herself. though occasionally she would see things that she felt compelled to warn people about. She never returned to Louisiana. She never saw Ravenshade again, but she heard stories, carried north by other escaped slaves, about a plantation that had fallen to ruin, about a master who died of a broken heart, about marks carved into doors and mirrors that had predicted it all. Some of those slaves, when they reached Philadelphia, sought her out. They wanted to thank her, to call her a hero, to celebrate her revenge against the Thornwood family. But Clara would shake her head when they came. She would sign, "I brought no revenge. I only read what was already written. Thornwood killed himself with his own cruelty. I just told him it was coming." The years passed. The Civil War came and went, finally ending the institution that had stolen Clara's tongue and so many millions of lives. Clara lived to see slavery abolished, lived to see former slaves walking free, lived to see a new world being born from the ashes of the old. She died in 1891, an old woman of 73, surrounded by friends and the children she'd helped raise through her work with the Quaker community. Her gift never left her. Until the day she died, she could see the writing on walls no one else perceived, could read the names and dates written in invisible ink by whatever force governed life and death. But in her final years, she saw more futures that could be changed, more moments where choice mattered. Maybe the world was opening up, becoming less fixed, less determined, or maybe she'd just learned to see the possibilities that had always been there. On her deathbed, surrounded by people who loved her, Clara signed one final message. The future is not as fixed as people think. Every moment is a door. Most walk through without looking, but if you look, really look, sometimes you can choose a different door. That's the real gift. Not seeing what's coming, but knowing we can sometimes change it. Then she closed her eyes and let go, her lips moving one last time in words only she could hear, reading her own name in the great book of endings, accepting her place in the story she'd been telling all along. Back in Louisiana, Ravenshade Plantation stood empty and rotting, gradually being reclaimed by the swamps and forests. Locals gave it a wide berth, claiming they heard knocking at night, 3 slow knocks on doors that no longer existed, announcing deaths that had already occurred. They said a ghost walked those ruins sometimes, a thin woman with a scar where her tongue should be, her hands moving in signs that spelled out prophecies for anyone who could read them. They said she marked doors in the old quarters, left crosses on the crumbling walls of the main house, kept counting down to deaths that would never come because everyone who'd wronged her was already gone. But Samuel, who'd made it to Canada and freedom, who'd built a new life and raised children who never knew chains, knew the truth. Clara wasn't haunting Ravenshade. Clara was free, had been free since the day Drummond's papers burned, had earned her freedom through nothing but stubborn survival and the gift that had terrified everyone who saw it. The marks at Ravenshade, if they existed at all, weren't Clara's work. They were just the plantation itself, the weight of all that suffering and cruelty carving its own prophecies into wood and stone and the very air itself. Places like Ravenshade marked themselves, wrote their own doom in the blood and tears they'd demanded as payment for all that white sugar and false prosperity. Clara had simply been the one person who could read what the plantation had written about itself. A place built on injustice cannot stand. A house divided will fall. What you sow in cruelty, you will reap in death. 7 marks for 7 deaths, all leading back to the man who'd thought he could silence truth by cutting out a tongue. But truth doesn't need a voice to be heard. It just needs time. And in the end, time was something Edmund Thornwood ran out of, exactly 3 days after a mute girl marked his door and told him what was already written in the book of his own choices. The story of Clara, the mute slave who foretold deaths, passed into legend. Some said she was a witch. Some said she was a prophet. Some said she was simply a girl who'd been hurt so badly that something inside her broke open, letting in light from places most people never see. Maybe she was all of those things. Maybe she was none of them. What matters is that she survived, that she found freedom, that she lived to see the system that had brutalized her finally crumble into dust. And that somewhere in Louisiana, in a place where sugarcane still grows from soil enriched by the blood and bones of those who were enslaved there, 3 crosses can still be found carved into old wood, marking doors that opened onto death, warning of reckonings that came exactly as promised. Not a curse, not revenge, just truth, written in a language of scars and signs, read by a woman who'd paid the highest price for speaking it. What's written must be read. What's read must come to pass. And in the end, we all answer for the marks we leave on others, whether we carve them with knives or whips or chains. Clara's story ended in freedom and peace. Ravenshade's story ended in ruin and silence, and that, perhaps, is the only justice some stories ever get. The knowledge that cruelty cannot sustain itself forever, that empires built on suffering will eventually be written in the book of the dead, marked with 3 crosses and claimed by time. The mute girl spoke louder than any voice, and Louisiana, for all its beauty and horror, never forgot the prophecy she carved into its heart.
Some days feel off, like I'm standing but still falling. A little pain, a little tired, and no one to tell it all to. There are days that feel unsteady, like I'm drifting out of place. Every step just feels so heavy, with a smile I have to fake. A little hurt I keep inside me, a little weight I always hide, and 1,000 quiet worries I've been holding deep inside. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you. I keep walking through the silence like it's all I've ever known. Every crowded room reminds me how it feels to be alone. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you. Maybe one day I'll be stronger, maybe I'll learn how to speak, but for now I keep it buried in the parts of me too weak. There's no one here to tell it to, no one who would understand. So I carry all these feelings like they're slipping through my hands. A little broken, little lost, trying hard to just get through. All these nights I stay awake with everything I never say to you. Don't pity me. My heart doesn't need your mercy. I can still stand. on my own. I was broken by your leaving, fell deeper than I thought I would. But pain has taught me how to heal now and survive what once I couldn't. You don't have to look back sadly, don't reach out with guilty hands. What you shattered made me stronger. Now I rise where I once collapsed. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll learn to breathe again. I once begged for your affection, now I've learned my worth in scars. And the man you left in pieces found his own way through the dark. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll learn to breathe again. Begun. My heart doesn't need your pity, not another empty sign. I've got enough strength left within me to rebuild this life of mine. My feet are steady through the sorrow, I can stand through all the pain. You don't have to save me, darling, I'll rise alone again. I'll rise alone again.